Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to be talking about Professor Melissa Harris Perry's The Epistemology of Race Talk. We'll start by looking at what she means by the epistemology of race talk. Then we'll look at her examples of epistemically bad behaviors that she identifies. These are demands for proof, deflecting criticism with friendship, and dismissing the expertise of marginalized persons. So Professor Melissa Harris Perry is discussing what she refers to as the epistemology of race talk. What does she mean by that? Well, race talk is pretty self-explanatory. It's discussions we have in society about race, racism, and racial bias. Epistemology, remember, is the study of knowledge and things relating to knowledge, like evidence and reasons, giving arguments, etc. So she seems to have something like the following in mind. She's going to be looking at the practices people use when they give and evaluate reasons for claims about race, racism, and racial bias. Now, Harris Perry is going to focus on identifying some common mistakes that she thinks occurs in these contexts and thereby put up roadblocks that prevent us from making progress in gaining and sharing knowledge about these topics. Focusing on mistakes, however, you might use that as a basis for trying to develop advice about how we should engage in giving and evaluating reasons within discussions about race and racism. Moreover, by analogy, we can extend her ideas about these mistakes to discussions of sex, sexual orientation, gender, disability, and these other categories by which persons are often marginalized. So the first bad practice she identifies, she describes as follows. The first common strategy is of asking any person of color who identifies a racist practice or pattern to prove that racism is indeed the causal factor. What she has in mind here is when a person of color identifies a behavior or policy and says, that's racist, and the person listening responds by saying, maybe we shouldn't jump to conclusions. Hold on, what's your proof that racism is what caused this behavior or policy rather than something else? So why does she think that this is a problem? You might think, when we're concerned with getting truth and knowledge, isn't it appropriate to ask people for proof and for evidence of their claims? But she thinks that in this context, this demand for proof isn't just a demand for some evidence, but is often used to inappropriately raise the standards above where we usually have them. So instead of requiring evidence, it's requiring a lot more evidence than we would usually require someone to provide in order to count them as knowing. She says, given the history of racism, prejudice, and racial policies within the United States, racial bias, not racial innocence, is the better presumption when approaching American political decision-making. So the claim here is when a person of color describes a behavior or policy as racist, their claim isn't without evidence. Their claim occurs within a context where we have all this historical evidence that backs up their claim and thus gives us evidence that what they're saying is true. And so when you demand proof, you're dismissing that other evidence and requiring that they give even further evidence. You're moving the goalpost, so to speak. Let's compare this briefly with some of the ideas about skepticism we discussed earlier. Many people criticize Descartes by saying that he is inappropriately raising the standards for knowledge beyond what we ordinarily require. By requiring 100% certainty, a removal of every possible doubt, no matter how ridiculous. Some people think Descartes is sort of stacking the deck so that many of the things we commonly think we know, we don't actually know. Also compare Russell's response to skepticism. He says, look, maybe we can't have 100% certainty, but even if we can't, it's still the case that belief in an external world outside of our mind best explains this history of experiences that we have. And thereby, it's the best explanation, and that's good enough for knowledge. We shouldn't demand any more than that. Similarly, Harris Perry is arguing that with this history of racism that gives us an experience such that when a person testifies that this is a racist policy, the best explanation for why they're testifying to that, given that background evidence, is the fact that it really is racist. And that's the rational thing to believe, even if we can't be 100% certain. We shouldn't dismiss that. We should accept that as good enough for knowledge. Or similarly, consider Moore's response to skepticism. He says, it's wrong to ask for proof of the external world because the appropriate starting point is the idea that we have knowledge of the external world. And so the burden of proof is not on the person who believes we have knowledge of the external world. The burden of proof is on the skeptic who wants to challenge that knowledge. Similarly, Harris Perry is arguing that racial innocence is not the correct starting point for thinking about race. Rather, we should start from an assumption of racial bias, and so when someone claims that a policy is racist, we should accept that as true, and someone who wants to claim that the policy is racially innocent, the burden of proof is on them. Harris Perry goes on to explain that these demands for proof within this context often inappropriately demand evidence of racist intentions and not merely racial disparities. The claim is that this demand for proof is moving the goalposts by asking someone to give evidence that the person who created the policy had these conscious racist intentions that led to this policy. But she thinks that's the wrong place to look for understanding racism in this country. We should be thinking of racism in terms of the outcomes and not the intentions. And so if you can provide evidence that a policy has a disproportionate negative impact on the black population within the United States, that's already enough to identify that policy as racist. Because that right there is already harmful and bad. It doesn't matter if there were bad intentions or not. Regardless of what the intentions were, the fact that it has this disproportionate outcome is already bad. And so that's where our focus should be. We should not demand evidence of bad intentions behind it. How do these demands for proof relate to epistemic injustice? Notice that these demands make it more difficult for a person to communicate their knowledge of racism. That person is thereby harmed in their capacity as a knower, since it's more difficult for them to share their knowledge. So if that demand that causes that epistemic harm is itself the result of an unjustified prejudice, which is likely true at least sometimes, then it meets the definition of an epistemic injustice. However, these cases don't match Fricker's account of testimonial injustice, because Fricker explains testimonial injustice in terms of a credibility deficit, when it's harder for someone to communicate their knowledge because the person listening has deflated their credibility. But here, the harm results. It's harder for them to communicate their knowledge, not because they're given less credibility, but because they're asked to meet a much higher standard. The goalposts have been moved. And so we might ask, does this mean Fricker's account of testimonial injustice is wrong and we should modify it to better capture this phenomena? Or does it just mean there's another kind of epistemic injustice that we should recognize in addition to testimonial injustice? All right, what about the second bad practice Harris Perry brings up? She describes it as follows, which brings us to a second common strategy of argument about one's racial innocence, the I have black friends claim. So here, the idea is someone is criticized for being racist or engaging in racist behavior, and then they attempt to defend the conclusion that they are not racist or that their behavior wasn't racist by appealing to their relationship. Harris Perry explains why this is problematic. First, friendship ought to encourage rational reflection on one's own attitudes and biases. If you care about someone, then you ought to reflect and consider ways in which you might unintentionally cause them harm. Moreover, your friendship should not be used to shield you from rational criticism. You have sort of used your friendship in an inappropriate way. You have demeaned your friendship by using it as a way to deflect criticism. Harris Perry gives her own example where she, in the past, had made some claims about LGBTQ+ issues, and she had numerous friends criticize her claims about those issues. And she didn't respond by trying to deflect their criticism. She received that criticism and took it as an opportunity to reflect on her own possible biases. Now, it is acceptable to disagree and criticize with your friends that might belong to an oppressed group that you don't. However, you have an obligation to listen and seriously entertain the perspectives of a friend. That's part of what friendship is listening and taking their perspective seriously. Moreover, given the history of marginalized voices being silenced in the past, we probably have an even stronger obligation to listen and seriously entertain the ideas and perspectives of our friends who belong to marginalized communities. Our friendship with them gives us reason to listen and seriously entertain their perspective, and if they belong to a marginalized community, that gives an additional reason to pay extra attention to their ideas and listen to them. Now, I think it's important to emphasize here that we can extend these ideas to discussions of marginalization other than race. Even if you're marginalized in one particular aspect of your identity, you might not belong to another group that is also oppressed. So even if you are oppressed in one category of your life, you might still act as an ally to people that experience other forms of oppression. You should thereby take this advice as applying to that context as well. So how does this relate again to epistemic injustice? Yet again, this practice of appealing to one's relationships to try to deflect criticism makes it more difficult for marginalized persons of a certain race or sex or gender to communicate their knowledge of that oppression. And if that deflection that person engages in is caused by an unjustified prejudice that they hold, then it meets the definition of an epistemic injustice. It's interesting to note that this deflection, while primarily we should maybe focus on the way in which it causes epistemic harm to others in marginalized communities, interestingly, this can also lead to a kind of epistemic self-harm where this practice of engaging in deflection can put up a roadblock that will prevent that person from achieving or making progress in gaining a better knowledge of themselves and a understanding of their own biases. So let's talk about the third bad practice. She explains, "It's common for my interlocutors to question my professional, intellectual, and personal credentials. It's as though my very identity as an African American woman makes me unqualified to speak on issues of race and gender, as though I could only be arguing out of personal interest or opinion." Her claim is that there is a bad practice of using the fact that someone identifies with a marginalized group as evidence that their beliefs are the result of bias and using that as a way to dismiss the fact that their beliefs could very well be the result of decades of research, publication, and university teaching. This problem seems to be related to a systematic suspicion of the academic series of topics in race and gender. In academia, sometimes you will encounter this prejudice that somehow academic disciplines like gender studies or women's studies or critical race theory are somehow less academically rigorous or less scientifically rigorous than things like neuroscience, mathematics, or biology or genetics, whatever it might be. And it's thereby used as a way to dismiss the things that these people are writing on the basis of years of research. Harris Perry explains that this problem she sees is related to a problematic view of post-racialism or colorblindness. So these are the problematic views that the United States has somehow moved beyond its racist history, or this idea that we should not see color and we should ignore it altogether when constructing our behavior and laws. Harris Perry thinks that approach is problematic. It's not the way you should approach race. The idea is if you just sort of blind yourself to color, well then you're failing to appreciate the way in which that long history of oppression is still having an effect on the opportunities, is having disproportionate impacts on some races or sexes within our society more than others. So we can make some extremely loose comparisons with Descartes' project here. The claim is that if we start from the wrong starting place, the wrong foundation for investigating the physical or social world, it can prevent us from gaining true knowledge about that world around us and our place in it. When you go to Descartes, he's focused on the physical world. He says if we start from the senses, from experience, from that foundation, we're going to get a distorted picture of reality. And so he says we need a better foundation, a better starting place that uses our reason, and that'll get us a better picture of the physical world. Harris Perry is arguing when we investigate the social world of race and racism and racial bias, the starting point of post-racialism or colorblindness is mistaken. That's a bad foundation and it'll distort our picture. The starting place should take into account that there is racial bias, that there's a history of oppression, and that this is still being felt by marginalized communities within our society. And it's only then that we can gain a true knowledge or picture of the social world. We need that better sort of framework for investigating these issues. This leads us into a brief mention of standpoint epistemology. According to this position, someone's experience within a marginalized community can actually give them an advantage for better knowing the world. That person occupying that perspective, that standpoint on the social world, thereby gives them a better vantage point for gaining knowledge about how that social world works. So we can make a comparison and a criticism of Descartes' epistemology here. Descartes thinks that experience biases and distorts our picture of reality. Now, oftentimes that might be true. And his solution is to suggest that all of us can instead get rid of our experience and rely on this reason that we all have that will give us a more accurate, objective understanding of reality. Standpoint epistemology is criticizing this idea by claiming that we cannot get outside of our own experience and perspective to occupy some objective view from nowhere, so to speak. And it emphasizes the idea that even if experience might sometimes bias you, experience within a social position is not necessarily a distorting factor. In fact, having that position, having that experience can improve your ability to gain knowledge of social reality. Persons that grow up within a marginalized community, by experiencing racism or sexism or homophobia every day of their lives, they become more attuned to it and is thereby more reliable at identifying it than someone who doesn't have that experience of oppression. So it doesn't bias them, it actually makes them better at acknowledging what's happening. How does this relate to epistemic injustice? Well, this is an example of a credibility deficit. And if this deficit is caused by an unjustified prejudice, then it qualifies as a case of testimonial injustice. And this does seem to be the case. There's this prejudice that marginalized persons only defend their beliefs due to a bias they have since they identify with that marginalized group. So Harris Perry is giving the example that she deserves a certain amount of credibility due to the fact that she has this long history of education, research, and publication into these topics, and she seems to be talking from that expertise. But her interlocutors don't give her the credit she deserves. They are giving her less trust than she deserves in virtue of all that education because of this prejudice that she can only be defending those beliefs from her identifying with this marginalized group rather than from her research. And it's worth considering that this prejudice might be intimately related to that earlier inappropriate demand for proof of racism that we talked about earlier. We might also think about the fact that prejudices about intellectual abilities might also contribute to the credibility deficit given to those working within academic disciplines that study issues of race and gender. As an example, if you look at women's studies or gender studies as a discipline, there are many more women than men. And now, there seems to be a prejudice within our society that women are not as good at math and science or are not as intelligent as men. That prejudice is clearly wrong, but it does seem to exist within our society. And so if this entire field of gender studies has more women than men, then the fact that someone deflates the credibility given to women might explain why they also deflate the credibility they give to the field that has more women in it. And that would be an epistemic injustice done to an entire field of discipline. So some points I want to emphasize about epistemic injustice and the epistemology of race talk. It's important to note that these bad behaviors that Harris Perry discusses can contribute to the epistemic injustice of testimonial smothering that we discussed earlier. The idea is, if persons that belong to marginalized communities attempt to discuss their oppression, and their audience engages in these behaviors of raising the bars of evidence, of deflecting criticism, and of questioning their expertise, then those persons might perceive their audience as being hostile and thereby choose not to share their testimony, which means it's more difficult for them to share their knowledge. And now remember, our focus is on how knowledge functions in society in relation to injustice and racism. Our discussion hasn't been focused on the general concept of injustice and racism. There's lots of injustice and racism that concerns issues other than knowledge. Racism, sexism, other prejudices lead to injustice in the form of physical harm and violence. We see lots of examples of that. However, these readings are trying to focus our attention on more subtle mistreatments that prejudices within our society can cause to our epistemic practices. And these subtle epistemic injustices contribute to and cause other kinds of injustices within society. Like in the example of Tom Robinson from To Kill a Mockingbird. The epistemic injustice is that the jury deflates Tom Robinson's credibility, and thereby it makes it harder for Tom Robinson to share his knowledge with the jury. Because of that, that thereby causes and leads to a further injustice of him being sent to jail even though he's innocent. So understanding the harmful effects of prejudices on our epistemic practices thereby gives us insight into the mechanisms by which racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression operate within our society. So a couple questions for students to consider. How else can you relate these problematic epistemic behaviors that Harris Perry talks about to the concept of epistemic injustice? And do you think there's any forms of epistemic injustice different than those we've identified thus far? And if so, how would you describe those other forms? And is Fricker correct that testimonial justice must always involve a credibility deficit? Could it result from inflating the need for proof rather than deflating someone's credibility? We've seen some reason to maybe think that that's the case in this video. And here's something we haven't talked about, but I want you to think about. Is it possible that a credibility excess, giving someone more credibility than they deserve, could ever amount to an epistemic injustice? So that's all for this video. See you all next time. Bye-bye.